Hello everyone, today we talk about Catilina, Lucius Sergius, one of the most famous figures, not just in the late Roman Republic, but I would say so also in Latin literature. I mean, Catilina's figure was objectively a minor one, right? At least for what he was trying to do, he could have become, of course, considerably more important. There are people who went as far as saying that Catilina was essentially a Caesar who had not accomplished, who had failed, essentially. And there is some truth in it, indeed, because we are, as you know, we didn't talk so much about the first century BC in depth, but as you know, it was still a moment in Roman history in which the oligarchy was pretty, let's say, composite, pretty divided even within itself, right, and competing for essentially a monarchic rule on Rome, right. That this dynamic, as we will see, is part of a broader transformation of the Roman institutions. You can argue that something began to go astray from the time of the Gracchi brothers that were assassinated, in the moment in which the even the tribune's life was killed. So breaking properly there a standard of morality that was, as you know, deeply connected with the entire religious view of the political cohesion of Rome, and that would fundamentally end would put an end to what we call the Republic, but fundamentally the control of the Senate of any space, including the same Roman city, in 53 BC, fundamentally, when Pompey took over. And from there on, the civil wars and eventually the monarchic rule, or at least there were, as you know, some multi-virati, let's say that, shared power in a more even more oligarchic way, but fundamentally we're tending towards the monarchy and what would be accomplished by Octavian Augustus. And Catilina's figure is quite charming, fascinating, mostly thanks to the work written essentially a couple of decades after his death by the Roman writer Sallustius, who makes of Sallustius, I don't know, for those who have studied Latin literature, is a pretty famous author, and you always remember him because his Latin is very easy to translate, because he makes kind of history, but still in a story fashion, right? And so there are it's all very harmonic, very, very simple, very intelligible. And it's essentially reflecting also some, of course, the public towards which the stories were directed. But of course, he could touch on very significant political topics, such as, for example, the Numidian War, this idea of course, the corruption of the res publica by the Greeks, stating things like, if Rome had found a buyer, the establishment would have just taken the money and similar things. Naturally, these works were written in a historical phase in which also essentially the incipiently monarchic regime was trying to give an explanation for what had occurred, which is beautifully expressed in the Res Gestae, right, Divi Augusti, which basically points out how only a sacrilege could have brought the God-chosen people to fight against each other, right? And explaining thus that the civil wars, there was a spell had been broken, there was essentially a disregard of the sacrum, and this, of course, in a Roman mindset, went all in parallel with some kind of moral individual, personal responsibility, which is actually a correct way of looking at things. It was deeply ingrained in a much more kind of religious and cultural way that we realize. The picture that Catilina, let's say, acquired in this sense, historiographically speaking, is also one of those that in history objectively are not necessarily distorted. There are ways to make up things, right? There are not always kind of the simple-minded statement that history is written by the winners. I mean, ask Polybius or Flavius Josephus. I mean, it's probably one of the single silliest statements that a person can ever do in their lifetime. Also because it properly misunderstands the deepest nature of politics, of war, conflict, right? And there cannot be such a thing like history written by the winners, because the question is, if you won, that there is something there that happened that made you morally, sensible, and the narratives that we get about war in history are pretty damn clearly objective, right? Just paranoid conspiracy theorists are, in fact, to stress the fact that there is allegedly some kind of history that we don't know because it's been precluded to us, while the only reason why we don't know history is that we are too ignorant to study it, which is a completely different thing, right? And there is nobody trying to make us believe, who knows what, because the higher you rise in level and the more people actually know what happened, and it's just become for the masses nowadays normality to be radically ignorant. Doesn't matter what kind of titles they have or whatever, it's just a severe disease. And we know that, by the way, IQs are going down, so we are exactly in that phase that is actually pretty similar to the 1st century BC, right? Because there was essentially a populistic policy of some sort, right? The nobilitas, also here we see the new men emerging, such as Cicero, or rather, as Marius had been. There is, of course, a deep legacy here regarding the Sullan times as well, that is getting also deeply intertwined with the problem of the recruitment, and it's also from the Marian side. In fact, Catilina would be backed by both Sullan veterans and essentially some people that had suffered from the land redistribution for the veterans, for those same veterans, and that were essentially Marian in political legacy of some sort. There's a lot behind this, so today we will not make a radical analysis of the entire Catilinian problem, because it's really big, so I will have to make other videos about Catilina specifically and his conspiracy, intended in the objective sense, that is to say that they, as we'll see now, we're not even technically sure how much what he got into personally was just say something of his making, or a contingency as well, right? So, but the later historiography would essentially claim that this was the case, and made of Catilina a sort of tragic hero, right? The same kicker that, as you know, had opposed vehemently in some of the most beautiful passages in the entire literature of mankind, the Catilinarians, in fact, so-called Catilinarians, accusations, usque tandem Catilina, etc., actually depicted him after his death, actually as being provided with positive qualities, and actually qualities of a good Roman. As a matter of fact, especially from Sallust's narrative, we get the impression of a man who had everything, right? He was a bit of a, even a truly heroic figure. There were some qualities there in terms of his audacity, but also the loyalty to at least his fellow plotters and or his clients, those who had helped him, and he was followed by the youth, by quite say important people part that had decayed. Catilina himself came from one of the oldest families in Rome, the gens Servia, that however had differently from, this is the same thing is usually said for Caesar, as if though the gens Julia had been some sort of minor nobility. The gens Julia was among the top handful famous in Rome still, in Caesar's times. The gens Sergia is not recorded having received the consulate since the 4th century BC. So Catilina was evidently a rich man, at least he became so at the moment of his blood, as he had served fundamentally under Sulla and in other circumstances. For example, he had met with Cicero in Pompeii during the Marsian War, at the time of the social wars, essentially in central Italy, to those people that were staying next to Rome. He had served in the First Mithridatic War. He had actually began his cursus honorum. He had arrived to be governor of Africa. There, as we will see, he was accused of extortion. And these were all normal, say, obediences in the life of a Roman politician. Perhaps this is not to cancel Catilina's responsibilities. Of course, this was an incredibly corrupt system because the entire world at the time could not work without corruption, right? Especially the most advanced civilizations worked like that because there was no such thing like an absolute state in the first place. And as we've seen, this was the time essentially of oligarchs, of warlords already. And we talk of corruption at least for dynamics that went beyond the rule of the formal institutions of the Res Publica, but not because these ratios of power weren't actually quite meaningful per se on their own. So this, as we will see, would bring him problems. In any case, the fame of Catilina was already negative for some reason. Essentially, he had been in 82 BC allegedly the bloodiest executor of the Sullan massacres. You know that we will talk about about Sulla as just for his figure, the civil war with Marius and so on. But those were times in which, of course, blood ran consistently in the very streets of Rome. Those years were exactly the ones in which the taboo of armies entering Rome was essentially broken as well. So Sulla, as you know, tried to fix the Roman institution by also somehow standing aside and looking at the thing from the distance. And Caesar would actually accuse, famously enough, Sulla of being illiterate politically. Right? Sulla was one of the single most radically educated people in the Roman Republic, just as one of the finest of Roman aristocrats. He meant that by deposing dictatorship, that, as you know, was a very specific thing in the Roman political mechanism, was foolish, right? In other words, once you have power, this idea of rendering it back was somehow useless if you could maintain it, indeed. And Caesar would also be one of the brightest examples of that, not just because of the matter of power itself, but for what such power for the Romans meant. I often mention the video I made about Caesar's fortuna, and properly the political religion, which is even useless to call so, because religion and politics were, for everyone at the time, the same identical thing, right? You could not separate them. During the massacres of Marian supporters in Rome, Catilina is said by this Roman historiography to have done things like beheading himself, some prominent political opponents. He's been even accused of anthropophagy. Naturally, this is considered historically false, right? But we don't have to be surprised by how easy it would be for even a refined Roman aristocrats of the time, literally chopping a person to pieces. Look at even, some of what is depicted on the coins of some of these people's ancestors in even a few generations before, as far as beheading goals and other stuff like that is concerned. And those were really the times of violence. These men had served, as you know, also Pompey first distinguished himself at the Battle of Porta Collina. And they were men rising in kind of a military career. I discussed this in the video about Roman leadership. I mean, essentially, if you wanted to be a politician in Rome, you had to have had a command experience, because that was considered, as far as the imperium was concerned, so also, what you were provided with during the magistracies, the most obvious school. Right? You cannot be a politician if you don't understand war, if you don't know how to do it. If you have a completely... it teaches you to command people. It teaches you to organize resources. All these men were rising with latifundia, with slaves. They were properly habituated to be commanders, to exercise an authority, a rationale, a discipline. And so everything in the political arena consisted in testing each other accordingly. And in this moment of institutional crisis, of course, whoever could, let's say, go through illicit ways, but still kind of finding the adequate support to be salvaged at some point and still acquiring power in this ferocious composition, was also appreciated in that kind of regard, in that kind of risk and gamble that, again, was, especially for the Romans, always kind of something exciting, per se. When the Sullan regime fell, however, we don't have evidence of Catilina having been expelled from the Roman Senate, together with the other Sullans, in 70 BC. In any case, the optimates, as such, so really the cream of the Roman aristocracy, despised him, because they essentially realized that he had acquired an enormous amount of power and of money just through the Sullan conscription, so essentially taking out other people and cashing their property, their stuff. And this is the reason why, in his career, Catilina didn't manage to go beyond praetorship, right? In fact, he was excluded from the candidacy to consulship in 66 BC for formal reasons, that of course, as formal, were also somehow controlled politically. And in 65 BC, because he would try it again, he was under an extortion trial from the De Repetundis tribunal court. There were voices again in this kind of Black Legion that said that basically he hadn't hesitated to kill even his own brother-in-law, some say even a son, but this is all like vague, right? For those years we don't have the extreme kind of laid out certainty for or at least evidence for any of that, because otherwise we know a lot of stuff. So the profile from the historiography at the time, it was naturally written by aristocrats that had lived through those events, is the idea that this guy was somehow cool. He had kind of managed to rise to the top, but with very shady means that were casting shadows, in fact, on his overall quality and on his intentions. There is a deeper political acquisition here that, of course, Catilina wasn't part of, in fact, of the optimates, and as such was seeking the support of some elements, right, of the lower classes that thus, carrying out a populistic policy that, from the perspective of an oligarchic regime, was kind of the lowest thing you could do. And as we've seen, also having around him gathering some kind of the fallen nobility or some kind of poor aristocrats of some sort, right? So all the outcasts, all those who just the Imperium had showed that could have not made it and that didn't have sensible ideas and policies. Consider that the whole Catilina matter, as we will see now, took place in the time Pompey was in the east, and the Pompeian, say, political milieu, around which also Cicero, for example, gravitated around, was already the most powerful at the time. Pompey was carrying out lots of interesting stuff in the east, crushing the piracy, putting an end to the Seleucid empire, putting their tassets over Syria, making Palestine a Roman client, and all this kind of thing. So that's where he properly obtained the nickname the Great, because of his accomplishment. So we will see Pompey's achievements in the East. He was, however, away from Rome. And even though, of course, the Roman establishment feared also Pompey's ambitions, still, in his absence, especially during the Catilinan crisis, it somehow rallied around certain figures, including Cicero, that was a Pompeian, as we've seen, and that, however, was still representing kind of the good establishment, still was going by, even though he was a novus, right? So he was part of those families that had never covered a magistracy before, but that, given that had become very rich in Italy, could enter the Roman politics, and Cicero would actually become, as we will see now, even in Catilinan's stead, consul. So actually the imperium holder par excellence. So I repent not having talked more about this background, because we could go on, but we also have to finish the video at some point. So in 64 BC, Catilina finally managed to present himself, in fact, as a candidate for consulship, but he was surpassed by his political opponent Cicero, right? And for a few votes by his ally Gaius Antonius. That was essentially the brother of Marcus Antonius Creticus, so the father of Mark Antony. And Gaius had been expelled from the Senate, but he had managed to come back there and starting over his cursus honorum. So even about Gaius Antonius, for example, we know relatively few about this kind of widespread accusations, again, in Roman politics at the time, of corruption, things like these. But evidently this man was considered worthy enough to undertake the cursus honorum still. And the same is valid for Catilina by a degree, because he could, there was no reason up to that point, aside from these accidents along the path, not to even become consul at that point. Now, on Catilina weighed the suspicion of having organized a plot, right, between the 66 and 65 BC. This is the so-called First Catilinian Conspiracy. And that's where he allegedly would have uncovered his cards regarding the ultimate goal of essentially taking over Rome, right? Not differently from how eventually St. Pompey or Caesar would do, and how Sulla had already done, and Marius too. So that thing was not new in Roman history in the first place. And it was always possible in theory to mobilize the city plebs, in this case in a populistic fashion, against some specific oligarchs, taking them out with an assassination and so on. Because in Rome there were pretty stringent laws against, for example, bearing arms within the city gates, but you understand from all these events, Cicero talks about that explicitly. Of course there were there were weapons everywhere, as a matter of fact, and they were kept, however, most of the time hidden. Imagine Rome being, as we think of imperial Rome and the vastity of her architectural spaces, but especially at this point and before Augustan times, etc., Rome was pretty heavily kind of thickly packed it would remain also in imperial times, especially in the popular eras, but for the sake even just of carrying out it's all kind of a potentially fortified kind of buildings, areas that you must control in a way or another, in that the Roman government had never kind of had the full control of, right? Unless they, in fact, could call, as it would happen in the case of Pompey, to have soldiers properly marching on the city. It was not allowed in the first place. And still, even at that point, you had to be quite wary of for example, the power of the mob, of the collegia. You had to compromise with the plebs. And that's why the populistic policy at that time was so successful, because obviously the lower classes depended on the higher ones. It was hardly a classist tension, but the social disparities were so large that as the oligarchy was becoming ever narrower and ever more powerful individually, still there was this enormous base, right, of people that could be simply mobilized. It is the same concept, in fact, but by somebody, right? That's why we are in the age of warlords, right? In theory, it's the Roman people that chooses, votes, who has to get the office, the imperium, etc. So then the state, the aerarium, gives probably the precious metal to the consul to hire the troops, and in theory, when the mandate is over, he comes back. The army is disbanded. Obviously, it's not like this. What it's like at this point is that the state factually is these oligarchic groups that have an unspeakable amount of people and land on their own privately, or that depend on them in any case, and that can in fact pay for the recruitment of and the armament, the training of large masses of proletarians that eventually will not fight for, of course, any other establishment but the master under which they were as clients, right? So this is a pretty well known and the dynamic, and the whole balance here stood in kind of maintaining in fact an equilibrium between all these various groups, so that one wouldn't have wouldn't acquire even the decisive moral support of the people to take over the entire thing, as it would happen in especially in Augustan times, but after, in fact, bloody conscriptions, civil wars, and so on. So, even a more advanced stage of kind of institutional, at least institutional dissolution, or at least what was oligarchic passing to a monarchic one. And this first Catilinarian conspiracy, there are debates about this as much as the second one, regarding Catilina's intentions and by a degree the same involvement. However, it is said that first of all, the plot was averted, right? It was aborted, as it was essentially about to be carried out, and Catilina had not been subject to an inquiry, only for the vote of a tribune, and it seemed certain that if he had been elected consul, so receiving the greatest imperial office, he would have used his powers to exalterate the Senate straight away. Thus, the nobilitas had backed against him and against his friend Gaius Antonius the candidacy of Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, in spite of the fact that this was, as we've seen before, a novus homo and a friend of Pompey. Immediately after the electoral defeat, Catilina, together with other former Sullan sicarii, so assassins, was called in judgment in front of this cause. Was instructed that is the quaestio de sicaris, exactly for the murders carried out 20 years before in Sullan time. And this is mostly what probably on the basis of which the stories of Catilina beheading a guy and went on. This was a response, by the way, to Marian massacres too, of Sullans that had been killed in the same way. So again, in times of Roman history, that even if Catilina had done this, were evidently being instrumentalized 20 years later for political purpose. Catilina was not a saint, evidently, but there is also ways to make politics. Consider that at the time, at least, this was being carried out because of proscriptions. So technically it was legal at the time, except after Sulla died and the Sullan regime was partly epurated. Things had been changed accordingly as well. And interestingly enough, from these quaestio de sicaris, Catilina was absolved, while the other accused, however, did not escape the condemnation. So this is powerful because evidently Catilina was being supported by his friends, and he managed to escape. In fact, the relative court was presided over by Gaius Julius Caesar, right? And we can, in fact, speculate that Caesar wanted to maintain a good relation with Catilina as a man who, in spite of the difficult position, still counted something in Roman politics and had significant following. That was an important move because, as we will see, Caesar would also actually keep defending Catilina, at least to a degree, by which his, Catilina's life could have been spared, right? Before, eventually the point of non-return when he joined the the legions in Etruria, where for essentially attempting to take over militarily, even though the situation was desperate. And that was an important move from Caesar, however, at that point. We don't have to think that Caesar was necessarily, because voices right, that he was actually even involved in Catilina's conspiracy, which is possible, considering that, who wouldn't know? The entire story in Rome was, of course, known. There were secret meetings at night, different houses and so on. So a politician like Caesar, as well as many others, were surely informed beforehand these machinations were taking place. And Caesar had, at that point, still to rise significantly from a political point of view. So it was even in a similar position to the one of Catilina by a degree, at least in part as a background. It was different actually, but still, a success of Catilina would have brought more easily people like Caesar in power than, in fact, the Pompeian faction, which at that point should have been overthrown. In any case, in 63, while Cicero and Gaius Antonius were consuls, Catilina presented again his candidacy to the consulship, and he was yet again defeated. Exasperated by these repeated failures and strongly indebted, because, of course, in order to run, you had to spend an atrocious amount of wealth, he probably decided at this point to resume his primitive plan, and he, in fact, chose to attempt a coup right through an armed revolt. As we'll see, it wouldn't be just on him per se. I mean, there were other agitations, as we will see now, in the same Italy, and in general connected with the unresolved problem of Roman politics and society, and how the institutions cope with that. Consider that the cancelling of debts was an essential point in Catilina's program, and this was a very populistic one indeed, because it was winking not much at the masses per se, because those were already, as we'll see now, in conditions of subservience towards the great oligarchs, but it was actually a program that many of the lesser nobility, like Catilina's, could use to escape the kind of gravitational attraction of the most powerful oligarchs that were counting on that dynamic. Like, those guys had less money, but if they wanted to make politics, they had to still find it anyway. So they were full of debts, and the failure in bringing on this kind of debt canceling and weakening the blackmail capacity of the great oligarchs for political participation definitely was indicating a point of non-return in the same possibility of Catilina to make it in the first place. And this is an interesting step, because you definitely see many Roman politicians that tried and failed, right? It's normal, just in any political context, people want to rise to the top, they compete, and most of them fail. However, this was a phase in Roman history in which it was evident that just a fewer people would have now been controlling everything. Pompey was a good example, and Pompey was abroad. So his also his soldiers were distant, and if there was any chance now to take power, even with arms, so in such a bold, open way, that was likely the moment, right? So who would support Catilina in such a coup? Well, first of all, there were numerous adherents in all the social classes. In great part, they were former Sullans, like him. In order to ensure the success of the enterprise, Catilina tried to use, however, also the malaise of the urban plebs and the frustration of the peasantry. As we will see also at the end of the video, this is another cornerstone of the Roman social problems of the time. As you know, during the 2nd century BC, the oligarchy had really managed to oust most freedmen from even just land holding per se. They were stronger. We explained often how the land distribution, even of the defeated people, really worked. There was a sort of wide ager publicus, so sort of domain where technically everyone could settle, aside from the land donations that were sometimes very specific. They entailed the foundation of some civitates, but the rest of the countryside was open to anyone, right? So the most powerful people could simply settle in one place, and if you were just an independent farmer, you wouldn't even properly have the strength if somewhere far from Rome, the clients of a powerful noble, including armed slaves, could kick you out, right? Could steal your cattle, could occupy your land, and all this stuff. So gradually, and that's why the recruitment crisis broke out, and this was detrimental to the same institutional system. Most politics had gotten down to, again, who could control the most people to eventually arm them and mobilize them against political opponents privately, right? And very significant events that had occurred, including Spartacus' revolt, that people think, it's about the gladiators, it's about the slaves. No, it has almost nothing to do with that. The real cause of that was actually within the Roman citizenry. Spartacus' army was full of Roman citizens. And the Spartacus goes in parallel with other coups, with other rebellions that had occurred of important social meaning, rather than whatever you would think it otherwise, because the same Roman citizens at that point had nothing to lose. Why did the Marian reform occur? Because of the proletariat, because there was this huge manpower that had practically nothing, and that, according to the old recruitment laws, could not afford the duty and privilege to be a Roman soldier. And now those limits were taken out, so everybody could enlist, and they would want that because they had literally nothing to lose, and there were some, legitimate expectations from military service under a powerful lord, such as being rewarded with land, which was the first movement there, with slaves, with some kinds of also tasks of social promotion from their most abject misery. Right, and this was the case throughout Italy, right? So where most of the same manpower sources would be found, and that's why Catilina and his company could find such support, because some of them actually hated the Sullans, as we'll see now. Some Marians, some former Marians, joined Catilina's side. So that's quite interesting, because it shows you that. How much flattened the political orientation was now on a social base, right? And Catilina wanted to make leverage on this. The urban plebs also was necessary because, not just because Rome was already huge demographically, but because, of course, if you could occupy the city, you could basically rule over the Senate, so you could pass all the laws you wanted. So this, as the civil war during the civil war of Marius and Sulla had been evident, wouldn't actually make you necessarily win, because somebody had greater force, could march on the city and overthrowing you accordingly. But at least in order to carry out the coup while Pompey was in Asia, this would do. And in fact, Catilina following succeeded, especially in a land like Etruria, where there was some unrest due both to the former Marians, whose possessions had been confiscated by Sulla, and nobody, of course, had given them back, but also these same Sullan veterans. So these were soldiers, by the way, so they would know how, when properly armed, how to make their way through through Italy, that had not managed to in fact enjoy significantly to earn satisfactorily from those lands that had been given to them by the dictator Sullan, and they had sold them for the aforementioned reason, because they could receive these land plots, but if these were amidst hyper powerful oligarchic estate, there was no chance, to compete with them economically, and so they even preferred to sell those farms, and then hoping knows what. And a broader desperation, as you understand. So these were men who had fought, who had bled abroad during some of the most, difficult times of the Republic, and maintaining its integrity as far as the imperial possession of Rome were concerned, and that now they had felt betrayed, and as they had turned back, they had impoverished again, as coming back as proletarians, just when they had started their military service. So this gives you a degree of the frustration of these people, and these people were dangerous because they had a widespread support, plus they were the killing machines that the Roman legionaries of 1st century BC as fully professional troops had now become. Sallustius, in his Bellum Catilinae, distinguishes clearly the two cores of the plot. From one side, a group of avid and ambitious noblemen. From the other side, the peasants reduced to misery and abandoned to their destiny by the Senate, so by those oligarchs that they were basically under, but that were not even so, of course, they wouldn't care particularly even about these people per se, as long as they could maintain power. Here there is another issue of this phase of Roman history, that is the degree by which Rome could satisfy these people's demands, meaning that, as you have seen also from some map that I placed here, Rome basically at this point still controlled Mediterranean lands, She had not needed to venture in the hinterland because it was satisfactory just to control the most important ports around the Mediterranean. They had the manpower and just deterrent capacity to keep these other the various peoples under. Also, continental Europe fundamentally gravitated around Rome. Aside from the various problems that could arise here and there, Rome just would, as you know, use some at this point, especially for the sake of deterrent, just to exterminate. But there were some sectors that had exacerbated also the recruitment problems, such as Spain, where also the same Pompey had failed back in the day against Sertorius, that had, as you know, was a former Marian who remained in Spain and fundamentally made leverage on the Celtiberian feeling against Rome, to even through a sort of romanization of the same people, but say to try to fragment the Republic in that still kind of clash between leaders. So it was a moment of stagnation, just the civil wars, think about Caesar, and how he would come to power. Why would his legionnaires fight and die, conquering Gaul in the entire Gaul in 8 years for? But for the land they could seize in Gaul, for the slaves they could seize in Gaul, for the future they could have in Gaul, So you had to give them something to fight and die for, and this had been properly the sap of the Roman civilizational superiority. And in fact, it would remain as such throughout all the early empire, where especially the Julian dynasty, but beyond, understood perfectly well that the strongest way to keep the empire together was to expand it, then eventually reach some extent where You cannot go beyond because of the intrinsic, limits of a pre-industrial power. But in order to avoid the stagnation and this kind of implosion, especially of a unitary government with such a huge potential like the Roman one, you needed to provide the people with a motivation. These were all people that were still up to a fight, right? The Italians had showed that during the Social War, how it was an astonishing bath of blood between the same people. Fundamentally, it was a sort of civil war in that case as well, just for obtaining that citizenship, and also, just imagine if that had been just for land per se, right? So just imagine all these masses that up to a few centuries before were fundamentally tribesmen, how much they craved for getting promoted and somehow redempted and transfigured by imperial victory and the rule over our people. This coup was a chance to, we don't know what Catilina would have done, because about him we don't have that kind of splendid aura that eventually Caesar would maintain, thanks to Octavian, etc. But just for his broader project, as he was definitely for what we understand, much more of a political mind than these other actors. But we don't have to underestimate Catilina, because we know relatively few about that, and the few that we know is just like he was kind of weak, like, this was a bit the tension in Roman morals, saying, between, of course, the virtus and the disciplina, and properly the idea that you can be provided with the best qualities from ancestry, from nature. You can have cultivated very good power, but if you do not know how to use it, and if you do it for something that is going to fail, is going to compromise with the lowest elements, such as in this case the plebs and or the fallen nobility, etc., people have already lost practically. And with such, kind of emergentially attempted coup and so on, that would fail naturally, but that was already something less dangerous than other things that had already occurred in Roman history by that point from the within. You yourself don't have that degree of imperium that you would like to obtain, even just to accomplish this relatively limited goal, right? And in fact, so the Sallustian narrative winks fundamentally at the peasantry, right? There is already there some bit of a popularis bias, because, of course, at that point it was mostly a situation in which it was Caesar's legacy that had kicked in, and so Caesar also was a popularis, but it doesn't quite mean populus per se, right? Actually, if you look at the optimatus and the popularis, they actually were pursuing the same means, just they used the same ends, the same goals. They used slightly different means, but these barely had to do with some specific ideologies. There was nothing like properly left and right. There are similar dynamics sometimes, but you don't have to think that somebody who was a popularis actually liked the people, or was even advocating for their power, right? Like you see today, there are a lot of kind of ultra elite that they say they're socialists or whatever, but at the time, properly this ideology did not exist, because the same people had a completely different view of what they could have. It was just, of course, as always, the people has the lowest understanding, the lowest competence, they deserve the least, and that's why they end at the bottom. But en masse, at least, they can still, and also individually, they can aspire to that kind of qualitative value, and not just even in a way that would consider some broader sort of equality of, there is a debate on this, because naturally the same Roman political culture had been about the sense of a strong citizenry that made the Roman backbone, especially the soldiers and so on. But of course, this was in function of that systematic, conquest, right, of other people that were like everywhere in the world considered like if as losers, to lose their own personal freedom and to just work for what were not proletarians anymore. If you had now lands, slaves, animals, clients, and so on, right? So that's a very important aspect, because it's as if you could see much more directly what the means of promotion were. So the peasantry was dangerous by a degree. The previous revolts in southern Italy had showed this, because the peasantry did have their chiefs. This peasantry, as we've seen, could have been veterans of some sort. There were all some combatantistic instances that said, we want our imperium back fundamentally, and we will take it back, of course, ourselves. And Lucius, in this sense, looks at them under a more favorable light, because they were at least more relatable, right? They weren't. They were trying to at least strive into the top. The avid and ambitious noblemen were instead some kind of losers within the same system that could not make it alone, but using this other force, but by challenging an establishment that was still superior to them, because they were an establishment as much as they had been convincing their own clients and so other peasants, etc., that was the natural order of things. We could digress further, but I'll skip this aspect. Now, in November 63, Catilina was famously and violently attacked in the Senate by Cicero. And he understood that every possibility to act had been precluded to him. At this point, there weren't proofs that he had plotted. At least they hadn't been certain yet, but so that's why he could stay in the city for a while. The plot, would actually remain standing. However, before this would be enacted, he thought to go to join the rebels in Etruria that in the meanwhile had already risen, in part again for reasons that had not to do with Catilina's organization. They were already doing it in this climate of general instability. In fact, we know that Catilina had contacted the Gauls. The Allobroges wrote back to Rome by telling the Senate that basically he had tried to make them, enter, at least to send troops to be from his side during this revolt. So definitely there was an attempt to also carry out a sort of civil war, even with the support of foreign people or some kind of thing. But it was a pretty desperate and last kind of attempt to make things work. Some of Catilina's friends remained in Rome with the task of organizing a revolt in the Urbs, right? So that if he had succeeded just with the legions in Etruria, Rome could have had like a fifth column within it to open the gates and something. However, during the preparations, these men were betrayed, denounced, and Cicero, once collected the proofs of such conspiracy, had 5 of their leaders arrested, including Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, Mark Antony's stepfather, by the way, and a pretty, kind of weird guy who was a key figure in the Catilinarian conspiracy, but he lived within this kind of obsession with Sullan, even because a Sibylline oracle had basically said that 3 Corneli would have ruled on Rome, so he had attempted something shady already in the past. It was considered pretty moral. So this is kind of people that eventually Rome remembered having cited Catilina, even though by the admission, as I was saying before, the same Cicero, there were also some kind of good men within them, or it could be judged. So there was some merit. It was, again, as also in Cicero's views, as threatening this conspiracy had been, also unavoidably as a Roman, you had to admit there was some merit, some God-given imperium to it, because otherwise you could have not achieved that result. And so having such elements of the nobility or the aristocracy, or in general within the plot, still meant it was something about the current situation that they had gotten right, but of course being distant from majority, otherwise they would have won. This is what religiously would have occurred. And the Cicero, by the way, summoned the Senate to decide the fate of these arrested, and this was December the 5th. And that's where Caesar kind of stepped in, because the elderly senators asked for death penalty. Caesar proposed instead the confiscation of property and perpetual prison. So to say, there was a clever move, because to say, like, it's not that we can ever rehabilitate these people for what they've done. So, as Caesar, I'm not going against the establishment. However, I'm also giving these men something, right? And so, I'm showing also in the face of future, of their clients, of their of their clienteles, that I was the one who back in the day was not so radical for death penalty. And the interesting aspect of this is that normally when a Roman citizen was arrested, there was the opportunity of appealing to the people. This passage was skipped by Cicero, right? And that would be remembered in the future. In fact, many senators followed Caesar's opinion because they feared possible revenge in the future, right, from the families of those who would have been killed. Cicero instead intervened, fighting strenuously for capital penalty, which comes from actually saying Roman law. I mean, from Latin it is that capital penalty for a Roman citizen comes from the caput, it's from the head. You're beheaded, right? This would have entailed, of course, and Cicero was clear about this, assuming himself all the responsibility for this action, right, just to the death without any support. And his demand seemed, as we've seen, just extreme by at least a consistent part of the Senate. It prevailed anyhow because Cicero was backed by Marcus Porcius Cato. There was tribune of the plebs designed at the time. Cato had inherited the intransigence of his great-grandfather, Cato Censorius, right? Plus, he was the grandnephew of Marcus Livius Drusus, who had been assassinated also. unlawfully, and he, actually accused the timidity of his senatorial colleagues, and demonstrated that the situation did not grant compromises of any kind. This is also interesting because, I mean, what was at stake there? This was a coup, right? If you don't kill people here, and these are just the responsible, the heads, like the leaders, part of, they are plotting, by the way, in the city, while there are some legions being raised against the same Rome as close as Etruria, right? So this is an interesting aspect. So the Senate did vote for the death penalty, and the sentence was executed a few hours later. Actually, these guys were strangled in the Mamertine prison. So also, with an extra, like, you're not even worth dying a Roman citizen beheaded, right? And in this way, Cicero skipped the right of the plotters as Roman citizens to appeal to the people, right? He would have paid that personally, as you know, from his end. Now, the plebs of Rome that had initially showed a certain sympathy for Catilina seemed satisfied, actually, for the imprisonment and the execution of his followers, because the people in general like this kind of means, and also because Cicero, we don't know whether with much foundation, had stated that the plotters had wanted to set some parts of the city on fire to sow disorder and to enact more easily their plans. So they would have gone as far as damaging the city, and that fires were pretty serious business in cities built largely of wood, as Rome also, there were also, of course, stone buildings, but really at this point, pick Caesar's residence. It was just in the Suburra, next to the even some kind of lower buildings, right? It was some kind of political reason there, but let's say it would have been a disaster anyway. So we don't know whether the plotters would have actually wanted that. However, if you want to exploit a bit of mess, then you at least are so reckless, because you know that if the thing fails, you're going to die anyway. Well, that may have well been. So the people at least were convinced of this by Cicero. So at this point, the only hotbed of revolt was Etruria. In January 62, the rebels, poorly armed and deprived of supplies, clashed in the Ager Pistorenses, near to Pistoria, in fact, the modern city of Pistoia, clashed with the regular army, led nominally by Gaius Antonius, but in practice by Marcus Petreius. There was an experienced officer, loyal to Pompey, by the way. So basically they showed Catilina that even his former ally now was against him, and that he was siding with Pompey himself. And Catilina's end is famous. Their army was basically surrounded, because one army was coming from Cisalpine Gaul and another one from the south. And Catilina's plan, at least to the speech that has been handed to us, was to break through the first one so that they could fundamentally occupy Cisalpine Gaul. That was the at this point especially becoming the single most important pool of recruitment of the Roman Empire, and so just they would have had to cross the Apennine and getting there, but there was an army in between. And being surrounded, of course, from both sides, the supply lines and sources were cut. At least they were to exhaust them quickly. So they decided to give battle, and they were crushed. They were exterminated. All of them, as Sallustius at least observes, recognizing the value of the valor of the same Catilina, fell at their place, on the place where they had been deployed. So essentially, according to the story, they wouldn't give ground. It was a butchery practically, and they fought, of course, inflicting severe losses to the same enemies. Catilina is meant to have been found amidst the massacre, still breathing, right, wounded to death, but surrounded by a consistent number of slain enemies that he had killed himself, and so proving, and this is what the Romans loved as hell, like the fact this guy had made his final showdown, right? The heroes of the sagas, right? That there was something that he had tried, right? But there is always something about destiny that somehow for your fault, that evidently Catilina was meant to have had. I mean, it's his value that would doom him, right? So he died a true Roman, however, not a perfect man, right? And thus he could not win in the first place, nor he could have gone more far than that in the general view. There are lots of stories. I mean, from these narratives that would be interesting perhaps reading at some point. Today we will not do it. However, I would like to conclude on this with this thought. Like, the Roman peasants had already taken up arms in Etruria before. In 78, 77 with Lepidus, who is the ancestor of the triumvir later on. Everybody was somehow much more closely related than we think in that Roman oligarchy. Who is kind of a secondary figure, but back in the day when Sulla died, basically he tried a coup. He was defeated at the Milvian Bridge, and he left Italy, taking refuge in Sardinia, where he died eventually. It was the same times of Sertorius, right? Basically, the epuration of all the various kind of Sullan and Marian saga commanders that somehow were to lose one by one, or at least as far as the older regime was ending. In fact, what is interesting to realize here, that again, when you look at Catilina, you look at Pompey, you look at Cicero, etc., these were all men that had made their fortune under Sulla, right? The new establishment really derived from there, and they were all a bit obsessed with him, because it was a big deal that a single Roman had managed to rule the entire Rome. I mean, the Romans thought they were the God-chosen people to rule the world. Thus, given that they had lived for a long time among this kind of shared power, in which implicitly all the senators were somehow competing for a sort of monarchic role, what Sulla had achieved by kind of perpetual dictatorship was seen as a clamorous event, right? We deal with that just, this guy at some point took power. The Romans were dramatically changed in their mindset, because there was an example there had been set, first of all, but this example meant that truly just one could rule, right? So all the entire Augustan period, Caesar's view, as I've seen before, like it was saying Sulla being a fool for having deposed his powers, are heavily a legacy of also this figure. That is definitely, we will have to make a video about Sulla specifically, and multiple ones actually. But back to the social point, this Roman peasantry, which was Roman citizenry, technically, right? Doesn't matter how poor you were. If you were a Roman citizen, you were by blood. Unless you became a slave, you couldn't quite lose that, right? So part of this, as we've seen, were veterans of some sort. The Roman peasantry had risen also in various areas of southern Italy in 73 with Spartacus. That I can't stress that enough, that it mostly owed his success to the Roman citizenry, not to slaves, to gladiators, or whatever. Consider that in 15 years from then, there had been as much as 3 rebellions in the countryside. In other words, while these oligarchs were clashing for power over the Senate, the rest of the Res Publica was in turmoil, and especially again this enormous source of people and land, like Italy was frenetically kind of, was to explode because of what these people now had understood could be achieved. And that's why also, again, the emergence of figures like Pompey, of Caesar, because they thought there could be a single order in this whole, and at the same time something they could also participate but also counter when things were not going the way they expected. And on all these occasions, the Senate limited itself to reestablish order brutally, because of course you can't tolerate quite a rebellion in the 1st century BC in other words, and coping with other ways. However, at the same time, politically didn't take any measure to resolve this problem that was evidently at the root of all these episodes. And this was a century-old problem now, the dramatic impoverishment to misery of the lower classes. On the contrary, even more, the presence of this existence of this problem was ignored. And it's not to justify, but to motivate that. It's obvious that if the Senate itself is composed by the same people who are trying mostly to use these movements to clash, to prevaricate one another, like in the case of Catilina, well, it's obvious that it's going to be ignored. Because there is not a broader interest, there is not essentially a blur now between what is public, what is private, as it had always existed, but that back in the day, through the institutions, had remained under an important degree of kind of political control, because there was an opportunity for more people at the time. This was changing fast, and so the same senatorial capacity was deteriorating to cope with the problem. Cato, that was a tribune of the plebs in 62 BC, had a new law, a wheat law, right, frumentary law, passed, which augmented remarkably the number of the beneficiaries, with the first objective to keep the urban plebs satisfied, right? As far as they were concerned, at least there were other clientele so powerful, like the Pompeian one, as we've seen the same Catilinan conspiracy with this revolt in Etruria could happen because the most powerful man in Rome was with Roman legions pretty far away, and so there was this was also part of the reason why the thing could still happen. However, what happened in Rome was key as well, because if you managed to control Rome, and or also because there was another problem, maintaining the control of the city for everyone involved, not just the problem that the city would fall under somebody just per se, but that the city could be the place where still the Senate was recognized to not necessarily by popular support, but still, again, with a capacity to enact laws to to be viable as far as the institutional and legal tools were connected, because everything was decided in Rome. So the ruling class, the interest of which was concentrated in this power struggle, demonstrated once again just to be able to belate the problem, right? The incapacity in practice of holding the system together, and was digging his own grave, as politically speaking, because the more you let essentially the system collapsing, the more it's obvious that populistic policies will be enough to beginning to shift the to shift the tide wave. This is, of course, it would have been impossible by that point to fix substantially the deeply rooted problems of the mechanism. That's a problem that they should have begun to address consistently since the previous century, to say the least. You can appreciate, however, how quickly the situation escalated, considering that we're talking about, again, not so much generations before the Gracchi assassinations, and in general the infringement of most of the role, say, of the mechanism of the Roman state, right? And so this was, like in episodes like Catilina's one, evident under everybody's eyes. There was a lot of hypocrisy, as you understand. I mean, the entire concept of, just being, we don't want to make a coup. Of course, there was a legitimate concern. I mean, today we didn't even talk specifically about the Catilinarians, about Cicero's work, political views, etc. But that's why we must make other videos. Of course, there was a legitimate concern from a part of the Senate, of course, for kind of a more tendentially Republican orientation, not a monarchic one. However, the ultimate goal, like again, a Republican policy should have been carried out just by maintaining, again, the balance of the various elements of Roman politics and society involved. And if you were struggling for power, also because you were pressured by others in the system were doing the same, how easy was this to be? I mean, Cicero would be the one paying for it, still thinking that the new generation would try to still play the old rules. They wouldn't, because they had understood pretty well, fundamentally, what power gets down to, and if the system is disintegrating, you're not just going to stick to it for an ideal principle. So, of course, not to say that anyone was a fool here. However, it's a topic that we'll have to discuss widely, because, of course, certain outcomes were really, unpredictable by a degree. And so Catilina's figure embodies a bit you see, if you're acquainted with the Latin literature, those generations, you probably can taste how deeply the Romans also cared about this plot, these intrigues, let's say the ideal of the res publica, of the political cohesion, of the mores, of the sacredness of the institutions. And so the space properly of Rome, I mean the city physically, where these people knew each other, they played all these political games, they invited each other over to discuss, to plot, to regulate, to organize themselves. It's one of the single most fascinating cultural and political contexts that you can find. Right? These were truly those who control now the greatest power in the Mediterranean, and everything was decided there, those very places. Right. So we'll see this better. I hope to expand also this, concepts to perhaps even some history of literature, because I do believe that there is a substantial, cultural value behind this background, this context, that must be known. I mean, if it just were recovered, most people had just a decent understanding of Roman history, as much as, in general terms of what just like a school program decently built would be. Like, most adult people today would be much better, because most adults don't even know technically what happened. I've matured, as you know, a very negative opinion of what people normally can do, as long as properly their standards are concerned. I mean, the real people, not the people we would like or expect or want to live in. I believe this is something we are addressing, at least in the videos on the channel as such. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.